These are the wrap-up slides for Class 3, our discussion of antitrust. So Section 1 of the Sherman Act focuses on joint activity, activity where we take two or more separate firms that come together, people who typically had been competitors at the heart of Section 1, who then don't compete with each other. So classically, price fixing is seen as what we call a per se violation of the Sherman Act, Section 1. Originally, there were some questions about exactly what was embraced in this notion of a restraint of trade. The early cases said that that really encompassed every restraint of trade. But the Sherman Act moved to a regime that we have today where, as we at least articulated, it's about unreasonable restraints of trade. Section 2 of the Sherman Act focuses on a different situation. It embraces more than this, but at its core, it's about single firm activity. And the question there is whether a single firm who becomes a monopolist is guilty of Section 2. And again, that question was raised early, a little later, but raised. And the court said, no, that can't be right, that we run a system which encourages firms to compete. And it can't be the case that if they compete and succeed and win, but they're instantly guilty of a Section 2 violation. So the idea here then is that we want something more. We're going to want market power, maybe monopoly power, coupled with some sort of act for closing, is often how we articulate it, or exclusion. Excuse me. If you ask why we care about the exercise of monopoly power and the exercise of market power and the reduction of competition we try to control in Section 1, the answer is that, as we talked about in class, that monopolists have an incentive to reduce output below what we would see in a competitive framework. So in a competitive framework, we think that price is going to move towards marginal cost. And at that point, we'll get an output equal to QC. In contrast, for the monopolist internalizes the consequences of output expansions for market prices. The monopolist realizes that to sell more of the good, if you're selling at a single price, you're going to have to reduce price, and that means you're going to lose incremental revenues on the units you would have sold at the old price. And so the monopolist focuses on the relationship between marginal revenue, which is given by this line here. You can't see all of it, but you can see part of it, and marginal cost. And it's at the point of intersection of marginal revenue with marginal cost that profits are maximized. That gives rise to a quantity of QM, and as you can see, that in this example is quite a reduction from QC. So the consequence of the exercise of monopoly power is that what had been a large consumer surplus triangle, extra value that was going to consumers, that is really divided into three chunks: a continuing piece of consumer surplus, actual, as we think of it, economic profits to the monopolist, a transfer away from consumers, but also then this deadweight loss triangle, all of these sales where people value it for more than it would cost to make it, but where it's not in the interest of the monopolist to sell. Try to get some sense of what a case would look like, how you would initiate a case, and so the leading United States Supreme Court decision on this in antitrust is the Twombly case. Twombly involves a situation of alleged failure to compete by the incumbent local exchange carriers, the regional bell operating companies, and the telephone industry. And the problem with the process of drafting a complaint is that it's pretty easy to draft a complaint, at least to write the words, type them into the computer, and spit them out on paper. And so the central allegation that we see in Twombly is parrots, mimics, takes the language of Section 1 of the Sherman Act and just says, well, I think there's a contract or a conspiracy not to compete with each other, and give me the chance to do a bunch of expensive digging to find out. And if this kind of complaint suffices, the question is what doesn't. And the court rejected that and said we need something that plausibly gives us a sense that these facts are actually true. There have been developments in other cases, the Starr case in the Second Circuit, the text messaging case in the Seventh Circuit, which have now helped to flesh this out a little bit. Where I think what we're seeing in the cases is a demand that the plaintiff articulate facts suggesting the possibility of communication, and trade meetings seem to suffice for that. And then economic behavior, which seems inconsistent with what we would predict in a competitive market. All right, we talked briefly about mergers. The framework that the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission used to think through mergers, they've got these guidelines, and the guidelines are ultimately captured most simply in this grid that they use, where the agencies use the Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes, the HHIs, to organize their thinking about mergers. So an HHI simply takes the market share of the firms and squares them, and adds those up. And so when you have a potential merger, the change in the industry HHI is going to be 2 times the market share of the one firm times the market share of the second firm. And so the grid focuses on the post-merger HHI for the industry in the whole, and then also the increase from that. And these 3 regions here, those have changed. The older guidelines were more demanding, and I think this reflects the current practice. And then obviously the changes. Think about those numbers a little bit to think about what gives rise to a 200-point change. So if it's 2 times the market share of the first firm times the market share of the second firm, you're talking about firms that have a market shares that when you multiply them together equals 100. 2 10% firms, a 20 and a 5. And as you can see, that the region they're most concerned about is obviously the lower right-hand corner. We saw an example of this play out, at least in terms of how the complaint was framed in the AT&T-T-Mobile merger, which ultimately was rejected, where if you look at the complaint, they go market by market using exactly this framework. Okay. From there we switched to the Microsoft case, and I asked you to read the EU case for a little geographic variety to see how the rest of the world looks at these situations. I did start with some of the material from the U.S. case, and in particular this early exhibit in the case, which is the Bill Gates Internet Tidal Wave memo from 1995. And what's interesting, I think, about that memo is precisely the way in which Gates understood the threat that the rise of the Internet posed to Microsoft's business, this possibility that this middleware layer would emerge on top of the operating system, and that the operating system would be, in his words here, commoditized. And then the possible emergence of a series of devices that were, not PCs that we would use to access the internet. Exactly, of course, what's happened. The U.S. case focused on Microsoft's behavior in maintaining its monopoly. There was more that went on in the case, but ultimately that's what the court found there in a 7-0 decision in the D.C. Circuit. The EU case is organized around a different set of underlying documents, and there have been multiple cases in the EU. But I think when you actually look at the core EU language, and that's Article 101 used to be 81, and Article 102 used to be 82. That language, I think, actually looks very familiar to people who've read Section 1 and Section 2 of the Sherman Act. So Article 101 focuses on joint activity, agreements, and concerted practices, and then goes through some in particular, but obviously what we think of as the core sort of price fixing and market division and the like. Article 102 is, has the flavor of Section 2 of the Sherman Act and focusing on an abuse of a dominant position, and again picking up single firm activity, also joint activity, but at least single firm activity. And again points to parallel practices with Article 101. All right, as to the EU case itself, The EU case, I mean, there was two components to it, and our readings focused on one component. So the part we didn't focus on, didn't read, was about the interrelationship of Windows Server with Windows, in a sense that there was some sort of technical foreclosure there. Here, the material we read was about the Windows Media Player. I thought we did a good job in class of bringing out what was going on there. The EU obviously was concerned about the possibility that Microsoft's ability to distribute the player and to do so and guarantee an installed base of that would change the decisions that content record companies, as it were, would make in the formats that they would support, and that Microsoft, through that, would be able to achieve a superior position on the media side because of their distributional advantage on the OS side, the operating system side. The question, if you believe that, as to what to do, and the EU went down this path of requiring Microsoft to make available to computer manufacturers, excuse me, OEMs, a version of Windows with and without the media player. And that remedy basically has had zero market consequence. Microsoft, you can see these facts from April 2006. So, you know, a sophisticated analysis of the antitrust situation, you know, the foreclosure that might result from the complementary decisions that the content companies would make, and then a remedy, and I wrote a paper that, you know, articulated why this kind of remedy might be sensible, but a remedy that, you know, just failed, as it were, in the marketplace. Microsoft has had further dealings with the EU, so that's resulted in substantial penalties, and then a subsequent action relating to Microsoft's alleged tying of Internet Explorer to Windows. Rather than fight that case, Microsoft moved to a settlement, and that gave rise to the browser ballot that we see here, where instead of subtracting, and I think of the remedy in the media player case as being a subtraction remedy, have a version with and without. This is sort of an addition remedy, where Microsoft then, when it distributes PCs, is effectively also distributing on you know, relatively equal terms competing browsers. How that's working, I don't think we know. And if you ask the EU or Microsoft for the data, as I have, they won't give it to you. So that remedy, actually, you can see there's actually a number of browsers there, and that's interesting in and of itself. Okay, from there we switch to Google, and there's a lot going on there right now, both in the EU and the FTC. The EU has been reasonably straightforward about what they're looking at. They're concerned about Google's preferencing its own content, especially with regard to what the EU calls vertical sites. And those vertical sites are sites like Yelp, typically sites that are specializing in peer-to-peer content, users creating reviews for other users. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the FTC has search engine guidelines. Those are short and haven't been updated in what we might think of as the modern era of search engines, so these go back to 2002. The search engine guidelines focus on the idea that what we want here is a separation of advertising and organic results. That to not have that separation might be seen as a deceptive practice. And so the FTC's suggestion is to do that is to require sort of a clear and conspicuous separation of advertising. People are paying to have their links on a page from those where they are not. Okay, so what does Google look like today? Well, as I talked during class, a typical Google result, a search result, really is an interesting mix of behaviors. So obviously we have the organic search results, where it's not about paying money, where there's competition among websites to get in those, but it's not a direct relationship with Google. In contrast, we also have ads, and so there's sort of an ad hidden here that you can't see, and that's all done by auctions. Just pay money. and everyone competes on that in that way most directly by paying money. But there are other links on the page. So the product bar at the top is a bunch of hardwired links in favor of Google, and that's true of the map links as well. So no competition for these links. And then what the EU is focused on, don't know what the FTC is focused on, are the so-called one-box results. This is an example of a one-box, sort of a table of results. And those results for Google include links to the home page of, well, the Medici here in Hyde Park, but also to the Google reviews. And exactly what's going on there competitively is not clear, though the suspicion is that those Google review links are not being placed there on purely a competitive basis, and something else is going on. And whether that something else is going on is something we should couch as, well, it's a kind of advertising, and therefore inconsistent with the 2002 guidelines, or whether it's a tying issue, and the tying issue is more open-ended in the United States than I think it is in Europe. I think that's the question that the antitrust regulators in the United States and the EU are facing. It's interesting to see what the alternatives are. So if you run a search, the same search on Google, but do it not as a modern browser, but do it as an old browser, i.e. 6, they actually present a series of alternatives here, alternative places you can go to get reviews, sort of a kind of almost browser ballot-like result. And I think the question is that where we're going to head in the EU? That's what we did that day.